This presentation focuses on traditional assessments of cognitive outcomes of music instruction. Cognitive outcomes are kind of knowledge and understanding that one gets typically in a kind of music history, possibly music theory class. The cognitive domain is one of the most widely developed areas of testing because it's present in so many disciplines. So there are so many disciplines that focus on developing knowledge and understanding, while it may be only the arts that look at affective behavior or performances or products. Um, the structure for the cognitive domain, or the area of learning, the cognitive area of learning, was first developed by Bloom, and it was the first of all of the structures, the domain taxonomies that was published. It was published in 1956. It's organized in a way that the upper levels imply higher order thinking, something that has become desirable in education in recent years. In this quick overview of Bloom's taxonomy, which is organized by complexity, that is, the higher levels, the highest level here being evaluation, is thought to be the most complex type of understanding. And the lower levels, here, the first level here is knowledge, simply the recalling of facts or terms, basic concepts. In other words, you've been taught it, you've read it, now just tell me what you've read. Where comprehensive requires some kind of reorganization, interpreting. Application is kind of applying rules. So for instance, when we learn counterpoint rules, when we then compose using those rules, we are applying the rules. So it's an example of application. Of course, analysis is something that's very common in music instruction, where we're looking at a score or listening to something, and we're using our understanding of musical structures to take it apart and to form it and to compare it. Synthesis is most analogous to composing, where we're combining elements in new ways to develop something new. And finally, evaluation is where we make judgments about things. Certainly, when we listen to a piece, or maybe a good example would be as a ensemble director, ordering compositions, deciding on what compositions you're going to use in a particular, let's say, spring performance, and what order they should be in. So it's a complex process. You're thinking of the individual pieces. You may be thinking about how well your group sings or performs the pieces. You may be thinking of, what is the audience? Typically, as band directors talk about ending concerts with marches because it sends the audience home happy. So there are a lot of different criteria that you're juggling when you're thinking about planning a program. That would be an example of evaluation. Two ways that are typically used to test cognitive information are objective tests and subjective tests. Objectivity, as I think we've discussed previously, is defined by score or agreement. And of course, in objective tests, the notion is there is high score or agreement. And of course, that would be true certainly in a multiple choice test where the correct answer is keyed. So really all you have to do is go and make sure the student has circled the keyed answer. Some of the limitations of objective tests is they often focus on the lower levels of the taxonomy. That would be knowledge, comprehension, application. Although there are ways to, I think, write questions that are at the higher levels. And examples of objective test items are multiple choice, true, false, matching, short answer. Subjective test items, or subjective tests, are the problem with subjective tests is that there's more variability in scoring. That is, different judges may award different grades or number of points to the same essay. And the essay, of course, is a good example of a subjective test. When we're planning a test of cognitive information, we it's desirable to develop a test, what's called a test specification table or matrix. This helps us plan and make sure that we have a good understanding of covering content. So you'll notice on this little chart here, we've got 3 content areas: notation, musical styles, and texture, that are covered. And so that kind of ensures content validity. And then on the y-axis, we have knowledge, application, and analysis, the levels of the Bloom's taxonomy. And in fact, we might have all 6 levels. And what we've done in this grid is we've identified what items we think fit in each of these different squares. So there are some knowledge levels. There are 3 knowledge questions about notation: 2, 4, and 7. And there are 3 application level questions about musical styles: 11 items, 11, 15, and 18. So this gives you an idea of kind of planning for a cognitive test, strategies for planning. Multiple choice questions are probably the most popular item choice that are used in objective testing. They're widely used. If you write them carefully, they're unambiguous, and they have good discriminating power. Here, discriminating means being able to separate students who know the information from students who don't know the information. They generally should be clear, valid statements of important ideas. You should work towards maximizing the discrimination between those who know information and those who don't. We talk about the parts of multiple choice items as having stems, that is the kind of initial sentence. An example might be the Jupiter Symphony was written by, that's a stem. And then it has options or alternatives or distractors. And the way you modify those alternatives can make the question harder or easier. So if the question is, or the stem is, the Jupiter Symphony was written by, and the options are Mozart, Bach, Haydn, and Beethoven, that may be more difficult for a student than if the options are Mozart, the Beatles, Billy Joe, or Willie Nelson. Stems shouldn't be very long, and distractors should be clearly wrong. That there shouldn't be any ambiguity about distractors. Of course, you can all now go and critique the unit quizzes to see if I've followed these rules. It's undesirable to cite authority. So, for instance, it's not a good idea to say, on page 32 of Abels's text, he says this, or, an incidental detail. So authority, these should be general understandings that you test in multiple choice, and avoid wordiness. An example, the homogeneity of distractors, which I just, of course, talked about. This is, how homogeneous the distractors are is a question of how difficult an item might be. Matching items are kind of similar to multiple choice. They're a series of premises with a series of responses. And they're an efficient way to test a lot of information. There are some advantages and disadvantages. They're compact, so you can test a lot of things in a short period of time. They sometimes encourage memorization. They are fairly easy to construct. Use a short list of premises would be a good idea. And then make sure the directions are clear. Make the responses easy to find, so the list shouldn't be too long, because then the student has to spend a lot of time just searching through the list of responses. And then use an unequal number of premises, statements, and responses, so that it's not, once you've answered, if there are only 4 premises and 4 responses, then once you've answered 3 of the premises, the 4th response is a giveaway. So if you use 6 responses, then you've increased the difficulty level. Of course, there are other item types that can be used on objective tests, sometimes rearrangements. So, you present a certain chronological order of composers, and then you ask them to rearrange these. Or you can give them a list of composers and ask them to put in chronological order. Or you could order by other strategies, like put instruments in order by pitch range. Sometimes it's difficult to score, but what if you have a list of 5 things that are five composers that you're supposed to put in chronological order, and 3 of them in the correct order, but 2 of them are not? So how do you score that? Or if 2 are in the correct order and 3 are not, it becomes problematic about how to score them, score ordering items. Of course, another category that's called alternative response that we mostly label true-false items. True-false items are widely used. There's a big chance of error, 50% from just guessing. They tend to focus on trivial matter, certainly lower levels of the cognitive domain. If you're writing them, it should be clear that they're either completely true or completely false. They are a simple and direct test of information. But you could do the same thing in a multiple choice format, which of the following statements is true, for instance. They should be based on useful information. They should be really true or really false. There should be just a single idea in each item. And avoid words like always or never in your item question. Short answer are another kind of primarily objective items, relatively easy to construct, typically deal primarily with factual information. There's not the opportunity to guess. These are kind of fill-in-the-blank items. Sometimes scoring can be difficult. Are you going to discount the item if the name, if let's say the Jupiter Symphony was written by blank and the answer is Mozart, but Mozart is spelled incorrectly? Or what if the answer to the Jupiter Symphony was written by a composer? Well, is that wrong? Is it right? Is it right to say, a 18th century composer? How do you get partial credit for that? Maybe you could fix that by saying the composer who wrote the Mozart Symphony's name was. That might be a better way to say that. You try to write the statement so there's one correct answer, and there's only one blank per item. So it shouldn't be blank and blank trekked across the United States and discovered Oregon. I was thinking of Lewis and Clark. Okay, just one blank per item. And the blank is better at the end of the statement. So the composer who wrote the Jupiter Symphony's name is, that would be a more desirable short answer item. Essay questions, we want to use them. We think they get at certain kinds of information that can't be used in objective tests. You need to be sure you phrase the question clearly. They should be clearly related to the class goals and objectives. Clarify more precisely what you mean, rather than using phrases like, tell me what you know about romantic music. It would be better to ask, compare and contrast the romantic musical style period with the classical musical style period. One of the problems with essay tests is that they take a long time to do. So while you might be able to ask 40 multiple choice questions in an hour period, you can probably only ask 2 or 3 essay questions if they're going to do a lot of writing. It's not desirable to give students choices of which essays to answer. So everyone should answer the same essays, because one of the main ways of scoring essay tests is to compare. So if you've got some students writing about the style of Mozart and other students writing about the style of Haydn, it's hard to compare their 2 essays. There are scoring challenges clearly with essay tests. Again, you should specify the particular criteria that you're going to be using. So are you going to take off for spelling and grammar? That students should know that. consider having the essays turned in with some kind of identifier on them that mean like the student's ID number, so you don't know who you're scoring. That will avoid errors like the generosity or the halo effect that we talked about when we were looking at performance evaluation. Score them item by item. So if there are 3 essays that the students responded to, score all of the responses to essay 1 first before moving on to essay 2, rather than scoring the first student's 3 essays. So it gives you a better means of comparison. And of course, one of the challenges is, and which may or may not be appropriate, is the influence of writing fluency. We're all, regardless of whether or not how effectively the student responded to the question, if they write well, they're likely to get a higher score. There are 2 strategies that we can use to score essays. One is kind of the global way, which is there's no particular articulated criteria or criterion, and I would sort them into piles might be one way to do it. Okay, so you're reading 15 essays, item number 1 or question number 1, sort them into A papers, B papers, C papers, and then read through each pile to see if you've been consistent. And again, do it question by question, item by item, rather than for the whole, for just student 1's paper. You could also develop an analytical scoring key where you yourself would write the ideal answer, identify the critical components, assign points to each of those components, and circle the components and then on the students' papers to see how many points they get. So if you were writing, if you ask students to write or to do a compare contrast between romantic and classical music, maybe you would say that, okay, if they mentioned differences in harmony or differences in instrumentation, let's say if the total essay was worth 20 points, if they mentioned contrast or differences in the harmony of the 2 stylistic periods, then maybe they would get 5 points if they were correct. If they mentioned differences in melodic development or form, maybe each one of those components would be worth 5 points. And so by writing the ideal answer, you would get a better way of structuring your scoring procedures. The effort is to be fair and equitable. Here are some examples of mostly objective tests. So this is 5th grade. One of the things that I think we can do that's a positive thing about music testing is, not to rely simply on words, but to actually rely on the music. So here, the teacher is holding up and playing an instrument, rather than picking, let's say, a picture out, which of the following pictures is a bongo. So holding it up and playing it seems to make more sense to me. Or in the second series of questions, the teacher will play a short piece and answer items 4 through 10 by having listening to the piece, and the piece is going to be played 3 times. Here are some of the other items that relate to this performance. Again, listening. It's an objective test, but it's, they're complex labels. So the students is really, you would argue, maybe trying to analyze the work. And so you could argue that it was at the analysis level of the cognitive domain. Here are some other questions from the same test. Again, requiring listening, playing a CD. So you could talk about it being oral analysis. Here's another kind of listening example. This is actually off of the NAEP, the National Assessment of Educational Progress test, which is kind of this national test that's given. The items circled are, you can circle multiple things. So again, it's listening. There are 5 examples, 6 examples. Here's some matching. Didn't follow the rules as I suggested, more responses than premises, but you get an idea again, of some of the questions that could be answered and structure. I think this represents pretty higher order thinking. This test was developed, I know it's a little hard to read, but this test was developed to test um, college music ed students taking a woodwind techniques class, and it's focusing, I think, well, I guess it's focusing on all the woodwind. So, look at item 11, for instance, which is kind of in the middle of the page. Consider the general rules for woodwind fingerings. Which of the following clarinet passages usually requires a compromise fingering? So it's really, I think, pretty higher order, pretty higher order thinking in the domain. It's at least analysis, if not maybe evaluation. Um, you're having to look at these four passages and figure out, and they're all in different ranges of the instruments, and figuring out what you learned about woodwind fingerings, and then what kind of rules apply. So I think it's a pretty sophisticated a pretty sophisticated example. Um, Both, I think, items 10 and 11 are. As with attitude scales, there are ways also to analyze objective test items. One typical statistics we report for objective tests is the difficulty index. And that's simply the number of people who passed the items out of the total number of people who took the test. So in this first example here for the difficulty index, the percent of those passing the test on an item, 15 students take the test, 9 students pass item number 22. So if you take 9 and divide it by 15, item 1022 has a difficulty index of 0.6 or 6.60. We usually report these to 2 decimal places. So that is 60% of the students pass the item. It's interesting, although it's called difficulty index, the higher the difficulty index, the easier the item is. So if it's 90, if it's 0.90, that means 90% of the students are passing the test. And if it's 0.20, only 20% of the students are passing the test. Here, another example, same test, only 5 students passed item 28, 15 students took it again, so that's 5 out of 15. So item 28 has a difficulty index of what? Okay, 5 students passed the test out of the 15 students who took it. Which item is easier, item 22 or item number 28? The second item statistic, along with the difficulty index, that we report for cognitive tests is the item discrimination index. And here we use internal comparison groups just like we used with affective tests. So here we take the top 25 to 33% of the total score on the test, the students who got the total score, the highest total scores on the test. So, if you gave a 100-point test, we're talking about students who got, 80s and 90s, right? And then you compare those students with the bottom, the students who got the lowest scores. Maybe you had some students who got, 60 items or 60 points out of 100, or less than that, hopefully not. And again, we take the top 25 to 33%, and both the top and bottom groups should be equal. So, so if you give it to 15 students, then I would choose 5 in the top group and 5 in the bottom group, just because it's an easy number to divide by. Then for each item, you simply look at the percent of people, and by the way, therefore you ignore the middle 5. If you've got 15 people and you're forming comparison groups, you only look at the students who got the 5 students who got the highest total score and the 5 students who got the lowest total score, and you ignore the students in the middle. So you've got 5 and 5. For each item, you take simply the percent so we're looking at, let's say, item 23. We get the percent of students who passed that item in the high group, in the top group, minus the percent of students who passed it in the low group. So here's an example. We've got 4 people out of 5 in the high group who passed the item, and From that, we subtract the percent of people who pass the item in the low group. We only had 1 of 5 pass it in the low group, so that equals 3 over 5, or a 0.60 discrimination index. The range of the index can be from 1 to -1, and of course the higher, in this case, the better. The better the item discriminates, the better it distinguishes between the high group and the low group, the more it's working towards people who know the information getting a high score and people who don't know the information getting a low score. So good items have high discrimination indices. And then so to evaluate the items, what you want to do is discard the bad items. So a desirable difficulty range is between 0.2, that's a pretty difficult item, and 0.85. That's a relatively easy items. An item with the difficulty score of 100 means that everybody passed it, which means it's not serving to discriminate at all. And of course, an item with a difficulty score of 0, everybody failed it. So that's not really helping at all in terms of if our goal is to distinguish those who know and those who don't know. So we want items within this range of 0.2 to 0.85. Discrimination indices should be above 0.30. Now, if the item is the difficulty index, that is how many people passed it, affects the discrimination index. If 100% of the kids passed it, then the discrimination index is going to be 0, right? It's going to be 5 over 5 minus 5 over 5 with the 0. If the difficulty index is 0, that is nobody passed it, it's going to be 0 over 5. The discrimination index is going to be 0 over 5 minus 0 over 5, or still 0. So in other words, it's only going to be items that are kind of in the middle of the difficulty range that are going to give you good discrimination index. And then if you were going to make recommendations for revising items, you'd look, well, were the distractors too easy? Who wrote the Jupiter Symphony? Was it, Mozart, Willie Nelson, the Beatles, Lady Gaga? Were they just too easy for the students? So you need to, make those a little harder. You could actually tell by analyzing which ones were working and which ones were not. Did anybody really choose Lady Gaga? And if that's the case, then, if nobody chose that, then it's not working. You need to put a better item in there. You need to remember that you don't write the perfect test the first time. That's why we have these ideas of analysis, so that you can go back and revise it and improve the test. Certainly standardized tests, things like the SAT and GREs, go through multiple trials, and they use these statistics very carefully to develop items that do a good job in distinguishing those students who know the information on whatever the SAT or GRE is testing.